So today's talk is going to be called The Brains of the Brain. Why is the prefrontal cortex involved in just about everything? So I hope that you will find that this will clarify things for you a bit. Here's an outline of the talk. I'll first of all start talking about the development of the human brain and then tell you about how we as humans today compare to other animals and to our own ancestors. And the reason for that is because of a huge change in an area known as the prefrontal cortex, which is the basis for today's talk. And then, having introduced you to the brain and the prefrontal cortex, I'm going to try to go through how we understand its importance by looking at the effects of traumatic brain injury, the impact of drugs, recreational drugs, etc., as well as drugs for cancer therapy. Then I'll tell you a little bit about aging and mindfulness. And then a really important area, which will be of interest to all the school teachers and parents out there, which is the development of the prefrontal cortex during childhood and adolescence. And then finally, I'm going to talk about something that you probably weren't expecting, which is the possible role of the prefrontal cortex in criminality and repeated offending. So as an introduction to the human brain, this is a classic type of diagram of the person's head with the brain inside. There are four main lobes, which are areas of the brain. I'm going to go clockwise from the top right. The parietal lobe is the area which is important for things to do with our spatial sense of the world, our ability to manipulate information in a visuospatial way, and mathematics as well. And for example, it was known that Einstein's parietal lobe was far more complex than the average brain, and the complexity of a brain effectively results in greater efficiency, etc. Then moving around, we have the occipital lobe, which is the area at the back of the brain back here, which is the visual area of the brain. And that's the part of the brain that, first of all, takes information into the eyes, and then it goes to the back of the brain, where to begin with, we start seeing edges, color, and movement. And then those edges, color, and movement are put together to try to give us a sense of what is outside in the outside world. And this is an area that's really important for understanding the world and disambiguating the world. So, for example, in this classic ambiguous diagram here, you can either see an old woman with the black hair, the chin in the middle at the bottom, wearing a black coat, and her nose pointing towards the left. Or you can see a young woman who's wearing a feather on her head and the black hair again, but the white hat sweeping backwards. And what was the nose in the old woman is now the chin and the side of the face of this young woman. And that's what the occipital lobes at the back of the brain are doing. They're taking information in and understanding it and trying to disambiguate it. Some of you may remember a couple of years ago, there was a bit of a sensation of a dress that was two colors depending on who you were. So some people are seeing silver and blue, I think, and others were seeing an ivory color, and yet it was the same dress. And this was an example of how the brain can see the same thing in two different ways. In fact, I was interviewed on Channel 4 News about this, and it was the first time that I thought neuropsychology and fashion design had come together. Then moving around to the temporal lobes, which is this area here above your temples, that's an area that's really important for visually recognizing the world, but also for human memory. So this is where we remember the events of our past, which actually will be the topic of the talk in a fortnight's time. So, for example, this is a photograph of my wonderful friends from the London City Voices. There, we call ourselves the psychosexual family, and this was at our last concert at Christmas. And in fact, some of you will have noticed that I'm wearing this white shirt with the red crosses on it, and that's because we're having a Eurovision party tonight, and our team is representing both Denmark and Switzerland, both of which have got a red flag with a white cross on it, and I decided to invert that. So I'm a bit of a Eurovision warm-up act for at least our team. I hope I am for you as well. Then finally, but not least, we've got the frontal lobe, which is, as far as I'm concerned, the brains of the brain. And that's what today's talk is going to be about. It's how the frontal lobes are involved in helping us make decisions and navigate through life. I thought it'd be best to give us a sense of what's happening with the human brain in terms of development. So this is a 1-minute video of the human brain, a baby being gestated and its development in utero. And you'll see the spinal cord, which is the center of the nervous system, growing, and then how the brain grows out of it. And the voiceover and a diagram will tell you the number of neurons at different points in time, and also what size it is compared to an American dime, which is a small coin.
We're introducing ourselves into this process about 1 month after fertilization, when the entire embryo is smaller than the size of a dime. And we're going to look in at the nervous system where relatively small numbers of cells have been allocated, and then monitor over the 9 months of human gestation the increase in the number of cells and the change in the shape of the central nervous system. So by 3 months, we have something like 1 million cells. The nervous system is beginning to exceed the size of the dime. You can see that the future forebrain and the cortical region are expanding disproportionately to the rest of the nervous system. By 6 months, we have hundreds of millions of neurons, and the brain is beginning to take now a familiar shape. You can see the beginnings of the indentations, the sulci and gyri that Eric described, so that by the time we approach the 8th and 9 months, this is now a familiar picture, and we have tens of billions of nerve cells present.
So what you see there is the dime piece on the right-hand side there, which is how big the embryo is. Smaller than that when we first start off, and then eventually there's 10 billion nerve cells just in the brain alone. And one of the things that at about 7 months, he said that you start seeing those the grooves appearing in the brain. Those grooves are where there's a lot of folding happening within the brain, and the folding is effectively more and more neurons being created, and the more neurons you have, the more thinking power is happening effectively. Okay, so that's size as a baby. So does size matter? As in all things in life, it's an important question. So I'm going to start with this photograph of me with the great love of my life, Rover, my gorgeous cat who he went away about 26 years ago. So this photograph is about 27 years old. And you see he's got that little head. He's got those piercing eyes which make you wonder what he's doing behind it. The other person in the photograph is my nephew, who's now about 30 years old. So that's Rover with his small head. And at the other end of the spectrum, this is Pung Pung. Pung Pung is a gorgeous elephant that I met in Thailand on a farm, and I was lucky enough that she let me get into her bath with her and give her a bath. Now, as you can see, Pung Pung's head is rather big, and my head is probably the size of one of her eyes. So we've got 3 different animals there: a human, Rover the cat, and Pung Pung the elephant. So we've got differences in sizes of heads, so it's a bit difficult to compare. So if we look at the number of neurons in the brain, here we've got a comparison between 4 different species: humans, chimpanzees, apes, and then the elephants. And we see here that elephants have got about 3 times the number of neurons in their brains that we have. So Pung Pung was way bigger than me, so we expect her to have more more neurons. But then if we look at the number of neurons in the cerebral cortex, which is the walnutty bit on the outside of the brain, which is where more of the thinking processes happen, what you see is that humans have now kind of gone in the lead in terms of how many billions of neurons there are in the cerebral cortex compared to the chimpanzees, the gorillas, and then Pung Pung, who's falling behind a bit. Then finally, if we look at brain to body weight ratios, we see that mankind is way ahead of the nearest animal relatives, like the chimpanzee, and quite a bit ahead of lovely Pung Pung as well. So what we see there is that size at some levels does matter, but it's not the whole thing. It's about brain to body weight ratios, which could be important. Now, another way to look at it is to look at human evolution. So this is a graph of mankind and how our species, known as Homo sapiens sapiens, has got to where we are, that bit which says us on the x-axis on the right-hand side. And going backwards to the left is millions of years ago. And we see our previous pre-ancestors, such as Homo erectus and then Homo sapiens neanderthalensis. Now, what you see there is that as we've gone through the last couple of millions of years, there's been a change in just the skull shape. And so if we look at the Neanderthal man, we see that it's kind of recognizable as a humanoid, but it's not quite the same as our type of skull at the top, the Homo sapiens sapiens. Another way to look at it is this diagram here, which has got the pre-ancestors and a line for a particular ridge that's really important, which is this ridge here on the forehead. And what you see is that that ridge is becoming more and more, the angle is becoming greater and greater. And that is effectively because the front of the brain is enlarging, and it's effectively pushing the skull forward, which is therefore pushing that line further down. And what that's to do with is effectively the growth of the frontal lobes. So that's where we come to our other comparison with other animals. Here I've got diagrams of 6 species going from the squirrel monkey through to cats such as Rover, and through the rhesus monkey, etc., and then chimpanzees, and then mankind. And with all of these, the animal would be looking towards the left, and so the eyes would be on the left-hand side, and the back of the right-hand side would be the back of the head. And in blue is the area that we know is the frontal lobes, and we know that because of the way that the brain is connected and what the different areas look like in anatomically. And what we see is that as we go through the animal kingdom, the amount of the brain that is just the frontal lobes is increasing. So to one of our nearest relatives, the chimpanzee, it's about a quarter of the brain. But with us, it's a third of the brain. So what we see here is that in our own evolution, there's been this change in the shape of our head, which has resulted in an increase in the size of the front of the head. And that is probably because of an increase in the size of the frontal lobes. So what that suggests is that maybe our evolution and our ability to create society, languages, the internet, Zoom, etc., is possibly something to do with the growth of the frontal lobes. Now, as a neuropsychologist, one of the ways that I'm intrigued or fascinated and compelled by is how we get evidence for this from brain damage. So I want to start with a very bizarre accident that happened in Vermont in 1848, where a company was building railroads, and for the railroads, they needed to have timed explosions to lay the railway tracks. And so they had to have these explosions that had to go off at certain times to blast holes through rock areas that they were going through and then to lay down new tracks. And this is a man called Phineas Gage, who was working as a foreman on the railway, and you'll see that his left eye is closed, and it's not because he's winking at us, it's because of a bizarre accident that happened with the pole that he's holding there in his left hand, because an explosion went off. Remember, there were supposed to be explosions, but they had to be timed. An explosion went off before it should have done, and this tamping iron bar that was used to put the dynamite in place before the explosion flew up, and it literally went through his face, entered from his left cheek here, and then exited from the middle of his head here, as you see in the diagram. Now, it didn't get stuck there. It flew straight through. Now, to give you a sense of how fast that the strength of that explosion was, the iron bar, as it went through his face, it flew another 20 feet in the air. Now, unsurprisingly, Phineas Gage fell over. But more surprisingly, he didn't die. This was very bizarre. Of course, he was bleeding, etc., and he had to be taken to hospital. But after he was patched up, he did not die, which was remarkable. And initially, this just didn't make any sense whatsoever. And initially, there was a thought that maybe nothing really great had changed in this man, that the damage that had happened in his head, because that must have gone through his brain, must have affected a part of the brain that wasn't that important. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case. After a bit of time, although it was clear that what we call the primary cognitive functions, which is language, visual recognition, memory, and numerical ability, were intact, so they weren't affected in Phineas Gage, it became very apparent that more what we call higher level issues had taken place. So Phineas Gage became very disorganized. He couldn't make decisions. He started making really bad financial decisions. He ruined himself financially. He became socially uncouth, urinating in public, etc. And he'd been a very reliable person in his company, but he eventually lost his job. And so there's this really marked change in the man's ability. And a neurologist called Harlow, who was working with him, or who'd seen him at the time of the accident, was the first person who said Gage is no longer Gage. And he suggested that there'd been a marked change in Phineas Gage's personality as a result of this accident, and that therefore this damage had affected his personality. And it had affected his personality, but it's a bit more than that, as you'll see for the rest of the talk. Now, just to show you my my commitment to my work, this is a photograph of me at a conference in Cape Town with my wonderful friend that I was at with my wonderful friend Andrew James, and we'd rented this apartment. These are two of my co-authors on another paper, Jessica Fish and Robin Morris, and someone pointed out later that we'd managed to rent a home that had an African Phineas Gage in it. So Phineas Gage was our first clues about how important the front of the brain was, because damage to it resulted in this great change in behavior. Now, about 150 years later, a patient was seen in Iowa in the Midwest of America. And this patient had been experiencing great difficulties, including some personality changes. And when he was seen by neurologists, it became apparent that he had a major brain tumor. And that what we see here are scans as if you've sliced across his head like this, but it's not obvious unless you're a radiologist. So this is a diagram by the great Hannah Damasio, who's one of the world's top brain imagers, of that man's brain, as if you're going down his brain, down his head, and the black areas are the areas that were affected by this, by the tumor. And the tumor was going to kill him because it was pressing on other areas of the brain, which eventually would have stopped his life. And despite trying every drug, radiotherapy, etc., they weren't able to get that tumor to go away. So eventually they had to do the last ditch resort, which is surgery to remove the tumor. So the tumor was removed, and that involves cutting a hole in the top of the skull and then drilling down, because you can't go through the skull that way, you have to come down this way, and removing the tumor, and they saved the man's life. Now, what happened is that, yes, he did survive, but there was a very marked change in behavior again. What happened was that this man, who'd been very intelligent, very reliable, he was actually an accountant for a company, pleasant person, etc., started making extremely weird financial decisions, bankrupted himself, lost his job, became divorced, got married again, got divorced again, and in his 30s had to move in with his parents, which at that time in America in the 1980s just was unheard of. And here we see again a big change in behavior and abilities. Now, importantly, it was pretty clear that some things had changed, but other things hadn't. So this man, who became known as EVR, because in neuropsychology, to protect the patient's identity, we name them, we refer to them by certain initials. His IQ is still about 135, so the average is 100, and he's of superior intelligence. He could talk everything, no problems whatsoever. And yet there's a description of him taking 5 hours to decide where to go for dinner. And he was just incapable of making a decision. And yet this was a man who used to run the finances for a company. So again, we see this marked change in behavior, but now we're seeing more evidence of problems in cognitive behavior, which is the ability to make decisions, organize oneself, etc. Now, because of that remarkable similarity in the profile that we see of this patient EVR and Phineas Gage, what Hannah Damasio did was that she used computer simulations to create this image, and this was because Phineas Gage's skull and the iron bar that had gone through his face had actually been preserved, and they're in a medical museum at Harvard in Boston. And she was able to work out retrospectively, because of course they didn't have brain imaging technology in 1848, she was able to retrospectively work out which areas of damage Phineas Gage had suffered in that bizarre accident. And what she found was that it was almost the same areas as damaged in EVR. So with Phineas Gage, you have a rod going through his face, and with EVR, you have the surgeon's scalpel coming down through his skull. But we've got very similar profiles, marked change in behavior, inability to make decisions, ruining financially, etc., etc. I did my postdoctoral fellowship with Hannah and Tony Damasio, and I was fortunate enough to work with EVR. And this is a man who can charm the birds out of the trees. He's incredibly articulate. And if you'd met him, you would not know that there was anything wrong with him. And yet the man will probably never, ever live independently because he's incapable of making an individual decision on his own. So he has to live in care. Now, if you're interested in this area, then I can't recommend enough this book by Antonio Damasio, Descartes' Error. And it's written for a general audience rather than for an academic audience. And it's to do with the remarkable work that was being done in Iowa to understand the role of the front of the brain in our decision-making and reasoning. So Descartes' Error is a marvelous book to read if you're interested in this area. Now, importantly, with patients like EVR, what clinicians, and I know that there are clinicians who are listening in, were finding is that although EVR was known to have these major problems, the clinical tests that were being used with him at the time suggested that there was nothing wrong with him. So there's a weird thing going on that we know that he's got a problem, but the tests were not sensitive enough. Now, I'm as blind as a bat, so I literally, taking off my glasses, I can't even see the images on here, and I can't read anything on the screen at the moment. When I go to an optician does tests with me, gives me a prescription and prescribes these, and now I'm able to see the screen and read, etc. Now, a clinician who's working with the patient with brain injury has to have sensitive enough tools that allow them to work out what types of problems someone has so that they can help them in their everyday lives. And unfortunately, what was being seen is that with these patients with damage to the front of the brain, the tests that clinicians had at their disposal weren't sensitive enough. So that brings me to to traumatic brain injury. Now, you don't have to have a rod going through your head to have traumatic brain injury. It can happen for all sorts of different reasons, from assault, from falling over, different types of accidents. And this is from one of the first talks I gave you, which is the annual incidence of traumatic brain injury around the world. And the numbers aren't important. The main thing is just that the darker the color, the more dark green, the more traumatic brain injury there is in different countries. One specific type of traumatic brain injury is from motor vehicle accidents. And what you see here is that whereas in the Northern Hemisphere, you've got more generally traumatic brain injury, when we look at motor vehicle accidents, we see that there's far more motor vehicle accidents in the Southern Hemisphere and in more of the developing countries. And there are different reasons for that, which I won't go into. But the important thing is that motor vehicle accidents, which if they're severe enough or even of medium severity, can involve someone hitting their head against the wheel or the windscreen, and that can result in brain injury. Now, it's not necessary for the skull to be broken for brain injury to occur. Literally just hitting it on the front of the head is sufficient to cause some sort of brain injury. Now, as I said, clinicians were having great trouble trying to assess the impact of things like the motor vehicle accidents and the surgeries, etc., on certain patients. So in about 2003, I started working in this area, and I developed a test known as JEF, the Jansari Assessment of Executive Functions. Now, the details of this test won't be of interest to most people apart from clinicians. So just for the sake of the clinicians, I'm going to explain this, but it'll only take about a minute. So this test involves what looks like playing a computer game, and apologies for the 1970s TV screen look. This is a video capture of someone going through my assessment, and it looks like playing a computer game. And what we do with this is that we assess the way someone behaves within our computer game. So the person is walking through what were offices in the university I used to work in, and they're using the arrow keys to move around, and they're going to pick things up, put them down, etc. And there's different types of things in there, like a water heater, because what the person has been told is that they're going to be working in a business office for an afternoon, and they are going to help to set up a meeting, move the furniture around, and sort out some post. And what they've got to do is to take care of all of this, because unfortunately the manager isn't there and they've got to take over. So what I've done is taken the manager out of the system, given that these patients have problems with making decisions and organizing behavior. And you see there's some graffiti on the board there saying this meeting sucks. And this is because I'm trying to look at how people adapt whenever there's a problem and have to think creatively. So, for the sake of researchers and clinicians out there, on this graph along the x-axis, I've got the 8 different types of behavior that I can assess within this task, which involve things like planning, so it's PL, or selective thinking, ST, different forms of what are called prospective memory, and all of these are assessed within this task. And on the y-axis, you've got accuracy. What you see in red is people with acquired brain injury, so that's ABI, so brain injury that's acquired through something like a head injury or something like that. And what we see, and HC is healthy controls, what we see is a very big difference on the average score across my task between people with ABI and the healthy controls. And the reason that this is important for clinicians and researchers is that on the task that clinicians use at the moment, the patients, the ones in red, perform as if there's nothing wrong with them, whereas my task seems to pick out certain problems in these patients that the current tasks don't. So this is something that I'm going to be talking about a bit more, and I'll be referring to my task as JEF. Now, from this task, we can give the results to clinicians. And again, this is only of interest really to clinicians, because this is the kind of profile that I can create for an educational psychologist or a clinical psychologist of someone's behavior and their performance. And this is a particular way that we can demonstrate someone's performance, where the x-axis, the horizontal one, is 0, and any score above that, so a positive score, would mean that the individual is better than average, because 0 is average, and any score below the line is a negative score, and that means that the person is scoring below average. And what we have is that anything that reaches -2, we know statistically is a major problem. Now, some of you will remember that I talked about outliers in my talk on face recognition. So these are the people who are at either end of the bell curve. That's what that blue line represents. It's the edges of the bell curve, and where people are significantly different from average. Now, the reason that this is important is because this type of visual representation can be used by a clinician for this individual patient, patient 083, to see that for this patient, they have problems in planning on EBPM and TBPM, which are forms of prospective memory, and that therefore those are the areas that they should concentrate on in their attempts for helping this patient in terms of rehabilitation. Whereas something like selective thinking, for example, where the patient's score is almost close to 0, means that they're almost within normal limits, and therefore not to worry about that. So this is a way to use information from one test to try to help someone in terms of their everyday readjustment following brain injury. Which brings me to chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE, which is basically repeated small repeated brain injury, head injuries, mainly through sport. Now, if you see this, the guy in the middle in the white, this is an American football game. You've got someone in red coming from behind him on the right, pushing him in one direction, and you've got the guy on the left-hand side who's charging him with his shoulder on the other side. So he's got all these different forces on him, and his head is also being shoved around. Now, each time he's knocked around like this, what's happening is that the brain, which is a soft object inside the skull, is banging against this hard object, which is the skull. And each time that happens, even if it's not actually hitting something like a car windscreen, it's causing small amounts of damage. And each one of those small amounts of damage eventually adds up. And what happened is that a number of years ago, there was a lawsuit in America where the players' union actually sued the NFL because men who were in their 40s were retiring from professional football and then finding out that they basically had dementia, because all of these little knocks that they were getting on their heads from maybe 3 decades since they were kids playing American football, having their heads knocked around all the time, were not good. And in fact, if you're interested in this, there's a film called Concussion, which is a true story of a Nigerian doctor who's the first person to notice this and notice that the brains of some former footballers who had died, having behaved extremely erratically, resemble those of people who are twice their age with Alzheimer's. And so what you've got there is a possibility that lots and lots of small head injuries are affecting the brain significantly. Now, to have a look at this, a former student of mine and we looked at this by comparing amateur boxers, amateur wrestlers, and controls, who are people who don't beat each other up for fun, on my task. And what we see again here is that stepwise performance where the people who have the most knocks to the head, which is the boxers, performing the worst, people who have some knocks to the head, which are wrestlers, performing intermediate, and then people who don't beat each other up for recreation, performing much better. So what that implies is that the task is able to pick up the kinds of difficulties that are being experienced by people who are having repeated knocks to the head. Now, I know that in the UK, we're beginning to listen to that. And in fact, in Scotland, they've changed the rules of football at school so that kids aren't allowed to hit the ball with their heads, because it's now known that even just heading the ball is causing little amounts of brain damage. And they're also changing the rules of rugby at school, because as you'll see later on, a child's brain is still developing. And so what's happening is that those sporting little injuries, they're happening on a brain that isn't yet fully formed. The next thing I want to move into is the brain's reward systems, and to highlight how, what I want to talk about, I'm going to show you a video of another little animal, this time a little rat inside a cage. And this is where research was done, placing electrodes on different parts of the brain to try to work out which area of the brain is involved when we find something pleasurable and want to have more of it.
The video clip shows a rat with an electrode implanted in the lateral hypothalamus. The animal can freely move about the cage. By accident, the animal presses the lever. As a result, a weak electrical stimulation is passed through the electrode. The electrical current activates the reward system, which in turn reinforces the rat's behavior. The rat presses the lever continuously at a constant rate, at the expense of other vital behaviors such as eating and drinking.
So what you see there is that they've found a spot which, if it's stimulated, then the rat wants to have more of it, because the pressing of the lever is what gives another little boost of stimulation in that particular part of the brain. And the rat learned that each time it pressed this lever, it would get that. And it gets to a point where it doesn't want to do anything else. It doesn't want to eat. It doesn't want to drink. So what that suggests is that the area that is being stimulated by the little stimulation is involved in our reward system, that we want more of it. So a sweet spot has been found that seems to be important for that, oh, I want a bit more of that, thank you very much, part of the brain. So looking at the brain in cross-section, so again, this is going down the middle, and on the left is the front of the head. There's an area known as the ventral tegmental area, the VTA, almost right in the middle of the brain, which is the area that seemed to have been discovered. And we know from research that this is the area that is activated by all pleasurable activities, drinking, sex, food, etc. So this is an area that we know is activated when we do something pleasurable. Importantly, addictive drugs such as opiates, cocaine, cannabis, and nicotine, these also activate the same area because the chemicals within these substances are already within the brain. Now, that's a different talk, but basically these aren't foreign substances to the brain. They are chemicals that we actually already have within the brain, but they're in a format that is manufactured externally and then creates these drugs. So we know that these drugs of addiction also stimulate exactly the same areas that are stimulated when we do something pleasurable and we want more of it. Now, the reason that this is important for the frontal lobes is that that area, the VTA, is linked to another area called the nucleus accumbens, which is directly linked to the prefrontal cortex. So what we have is that we've got an area which is the sweet spot for fun stuff, which is directly linked to the front of the brain, and the front of the brain is the one it's responsible for us making decisions about whether we want something or not. And we saw with that rat that when that area was stimulated, it wanted more of it, and it didn't even care about eating or drinking. So effectively what's happening is that normal behavior is being suspended because of something going wrong in this circuit, because this is where addiction happens. So I'm not going to go into the details here, but we've used JEF to look at how nicotine is involved in a particular form of addiction, caffeine, which improves our ability to make decisions, etc., but it's a temporary effect, and caffeine itself can be poisonous and addictive, so you have to be careful with the caffeine. One unit of alcohol, which is within the amounts that would allow someone to still drive legally, had a negative impact on people's decision-making abilities on my task. When we tested people who'd recovered from, who were recovered alcoholics, and these are people who on average hadn't drunk anything for 8 years, so they'd completely dried out, they were still performing worse on my task than people who weren't recovered alcoholics, and which implies that there's a long-term effect of these drugs which doesn't go away. Recreational ecstasy and recreational cannabis. So most of these substances, which we know activate that same reward area, they also have an impact on performance on my task, which we think is picking up really important cognitive behaviors. Now, the reason that this is important is because some of those things are okay at a recreational level, but it's when you get like the rat and you start using these substances to the point where it's impacting your behavior on a daily basis and affecting your life, etc. And I'm not going to go into that, but basically there are different definitions of what addiction is. This is a heat map of alcohol and drug use disorders and dependency across the world. And what you see here, again, the darker colors, as you see found in Russia and United States, represent greater dependence on drugs and alcohol in those countries. So we've got drug and alcohol dependency that varies across different countries. And we know that every year the cost of addiction runs to something like $30 billion around the world. And this is because of things like the treatments involved, the loss of work hours, et cetera, et cetera. So addiction is a major problem at all sorts of levels. Another way of looking at this data is looking at how different countries have different dependencies. Now, it's a complicated graph, but this graph is looking at drug versus alcohol abuse. And what you see are two, there's outliers. We've got Russia, which is up there on the left-hand side, out there as an outlier, which seems to have more alcohol dependency problems than drug use problems, whereas the United States is on the is the opposite, where the big problem there is the use of illicit drugs. So what we see is that for different countries, there are different problems going on in terms of addiction. And these are obviously causing these countries huge problems in terms of their health systems, etc. So it is a big problem. And one of the things that people who work in addiction are trying to work out is why. And what can they do to reduce the level of dependency? And this is why work on the impact of the frontal lobes and how these executive functions, as we call them, are involved and how they're broken down in the case of addiction becomes important. The next thing I'm going to talk about is chemo brain. And this is something that I know that at least some of my friends are interested in because of either they or their loved ones have been affected by this. And this is a term used by cancer survivors to describe thinking and memory problems that can occur either during or after cancer treatment. It's also known as chemo fog or cancer-related cognitive impairment or cognitive dysfunction. So there's a number of different terms for it. Some symptoms include being disorganized, difficulty concentrating or learning new things, difficulty with multitasking, a feeling of mental fogginess, short attention span, some short-term memory problems, and generally taking longer than usual to complete routine tasks. Now, all of these things are effectively frontal lobe functions. So they're the kinds of problems that patients like EVR and Phineas Gage will have had difficulty with. So again, what we see here is that there's something happening with the treatments for cancer which seem to be disproportionately affecting the front of the brain. Now, one of the areas that I've worked in is prostate cancer. Now, prostate cancer is important because it's the most common cancer for men in the UK, and there are 19 new cases daily. But it's also the most survivable cancer, so it's important because early detection can be really important in treatment. Now, when they can take the cancer out surgically, that's great. But when it's not possible to remove the cancer surgically, there's a treatment known as androgen deprivation therapy, which is to try to kill the cancer by reducing the testosterone that's feeding it. And it's a very effective treatment. It's not a chemo treatment, but it is a treatment for helping the people with prostate cancer. Now, there's anecdotal evidence from patients who say that they've got different cognitive difficulties that sound very similar to chemo brain, difficulty thinking, difficulty making decisions, etc., that they attribute to the hormone therapy. But it hasn't really been given that much attention in the literature. And there is contradictory evidence on whether androgen deprivation therapy does have a negative impact on these cognitive functions. So we did a study where we compared 20 patients on ADT with 50 men who were age and IQ matched. And what we found, again, just looking on the right-hand edge there in the green box there, is in the red the men with on the androgen deprivation therapy and 50 controls who were same age and IQ. And what we see is that these men are performing worse on my task. Now, the important thing is that on the standard task that currently clinicians use, these men look like they don't have any problems. And that's like me taking off my glasses and an optician telling me that there's nothing wrong with me. Anyone who's met me knows how blind I am, and therefore it would make no sense for an optician to suggest that there's nothing wrong with me. And that's what's happening in this sort of case. So it's an area that we'd like to do more work in. Now I want to move on to the aging brain. And aging is not a disease, it's just normality. But we know that the brain starts thinning as we get older. In these diagrams here, you've got in each of the pairs, you've got on the left-hand side, you've got the outside surface of the brain, and then the image on the right-hand side of the pair is if you cut it down the middle. The main thing here is that the dark colors represent thicker areas of certain parts of the brain. And what you see is that the colors are getting lighter as we move across from the left to right. So for people in their under 30, we've got thicker areas of the brain. As we get into our 30s and middle age, they're thinning. And then beyond 60, they're thinning much more. And what you see is in the very front of the brain of 60 to 90-year-olds, this area of whiteness here, which is where it's really thinning. And those are areas where there might be problems with dementia. So what's happening is that as we get older, through nothing that we're doing, the brain is getting thinner. And that is part of healthy aging, but it is happening. Now, in the talk that I gave a couple of weeks ago in the Why Do We Know Less About the Human Brain, etc., I talked about mindfulness meditation. So if you want here for that talk, here is some data from that talk, which is a beautiful study that's looked at certain areas of the brain, which are mainly in the front of the brain, and looking at people of different ages and looking at thickness of that area of the brain. And in the red squares, we've got people who don't meditate, and you see the pattern that I've just shown you in the previous graph, which is that the brain is thinning and getting, so that line is getting further and further down for the controls as we get older. But for the meditators in the blue circles, what we see is that there isn't that. So the brain is not getting thinner as we get older if people are meditators. So my gift to you for today is that if you want to protect your brain, then go and learn mindfulness meditation, because it seems from the data that is currently available that it seems to have some sort of protective impact on the thinning of the brain. Now I'm going to move to the other end of the age spectrum, which is the child's developing brain, and I've only got about 10 minutes left, so we're on the home stretch here. Now, we know that the child's brain is developing, and you saw that video at the beginning of the embryo, and I stopped the video at birth, but what the researcher was going on to say was that we've got more growth happening in the brain after we're born. because the brain can only be so big at the point of birth because of the birth canal, and then after we're born, there's a huge sprouting that happens in the brain. So there's a lot of growth that's happening in the brain. And what this diagram shows is how the brain is changing as we go from 5 years old at the top left to 20 years of age at the bottom right. And the important thing is that A, the brain is changing, that it's still developing, but B, more importantly, it's that different parts are changing at different times. And the take-home message, the most important thing, is that it's the front of the brain which is the last to fully form. And they keep revising their estimates. But at the moment, what they're saying is that the front of the brain is not fully formed until the mid-20s. So even when someone has got their first degree, their brain is still developing. It's not fully developed yet. So what you see from the last two slides are that the front of the brain is the last to fully develop, but it's also the first to start thinning. So you've got about 30 years of enjoying that brain at its thickest, and then it starts going downhill, I'm afraid. Now, to address this, given that the front of the brain is the one that is developing the last, I used to keep getting educational psychologists and developmental psychologists asking me whether I had a task like the one that I showed you earlier, where I put someone in my computer game to go to work and rearrange the furniture. They kept asking me whether I had a task like that for kids. And for years I kept saying, no, I don't have one for kids. But eventually I realized that people really wanted one, so I obliged. And I created another task. And this time, rather than in a Dickensian fashion send kids to work, I tell them it was their birthday. So in this task, what happens is that the child receives a letter at the beginning wishing them a happy birthday from their parents, saying that they're going to trust them to run their own birthday party, and they're going to go out of the house and they're going to leave the child to their own devices within their house. And what the child has to do is to effectively sort out things within the house before their friends arrive, and then when their friends arrive, decide what food to give different friends and what activities to do, etc. And I've created this task to try to test those things of decision making and making selections and thinking outside the box, etc., that we know that patients like EVR and Phineas Gage had real problems with. So that's what this task involves, and it's known as JEF-C. Now, this is very, we've published a few papers on this, but this is very new data that's literally just gone into a journal for review. And this is my lovely friend, Yafik Gilboa from Jerusalem, where we translated the task into Hebrew, and we tested 10 to 13-year-olds with 14 to 18-year-olds. And what you see here is that there's a significant difference, and what we're seeing is an improvement in these executive functions as we get older. So what we're seeing is that JEF-C, the children's version of my task, is picking up these problems that not problems, aging is not a problem, the development of executive functions as you go through childhood. Now, the next study was where I translated the task into Persian for a collaboration in Iran. Now, my wonderful friend and mentor, Professor John Evans, said that the fact that I have managed to do work both with people in Jerusalem and with people in Tehran is my contribution to Middle East peace. So I'm really pleased to be presenting both Hebrew and Persian work one after another. And this is work that was done by Ilham Eskandari, who was doing a master's at the University of Tehran, and she translated my task into Persian. and tested this beautiful large number of students, over 150 kids or nearly 150 kids in Tehran that were 8 to 10, 11 to 13, and 14 to 16 years of age. And again, what we see in those bars on the left-hand side is that as the kids get older, from the red to the pale blue to the dark blue, their performance on my task is improving, which is what we expect it to. But the thing is that currently the tasks that clinicians and educational psychologists use don't give this level of information. So the idea is that hopefully this sort of task can be used by educational psychologists and clinical psychologists working with kids to help kids in the classroom. Now, this is really important because the work that Ellen did was with typically developing kids without any problems. But as all the teachers that I know who are listening in on this know, we have lots of children who are not typically developing. There are all sorts of developmental issues such as Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. And this is just data from a particular study which asked parents or caregivers of kids who had ADHD and parents of kids who didn't have ADHD, and just asked them certain questions about whether their child was easily frustrated, whether they had problems in their thinking, etc. So all of these are issues that we know are controlled by the front of the brain. And the basic message is that the dark blue bars, which is the parents with kids with ADHD, are much higher than the light blue bars. So basically, these parents are reporting that their kids have a lot of problems in these areas that we know are to do with the front of the brain. Now, ADHD is only one of a whole host of different disorders. There's Autistic Spectrum Disorder, there's ODD, Oppositional Distractibility Disorder, I think. There's LAC, Looked After Children. So what we see is that there are a lot of developmental conditions where the front of the brain and the improper development of the front of the brain seems to be really involved in problems. So we're hoping that we'll be able to do more work in these areas using my task to try to help clinicians work with these kids. So the final thing I want to talk about is head injuries in offenders. Now, what is seen by people who work in the forensic services is that many prison inmates have sustained a head injury. Now, what is found is that it's up to 8 times what you find in the general population. So if you went into a prison and asked the inmates there whether they'd ever had a head injury, and then went out to your high street and did the same, the percentage of people that you'd get in the prison would be 8 times what you'd get on your high street. Now, it's very easy to suggest that maybe this is just because these are people who are in prison, and people in prison, they're naughty, they're bad, they're whatever, and they engage in beating each other up. But that's not the case, because what we find is that in most cases, the first head injury happened before the first criminal offense. So what we see is that we have a lot of people in prisons who have had head injuries and then they commit their first crime. Now, this is quite troubling, and people who work with children who have head injuries and brain, and therefore some forms of brain damage, find that those kids are the ones that end up being, I think, 4 times as likely to have difficulties in their behavior and then delinquent behavior later on, and then some of those end up with criminality. Now, as an example, some of you will remember the serial killer Fred West, who, along with his wife Rosemary, killed a number of young women in the 80s, I think it was, and then buried them in their garden. Now, Fred West had been involved in a motorcycle accident at the age of 17, where he fractured his skull and he lost consciousness. And the family said that after the accident, he would erupt into fits of rage, which weren't part of the usual behavior before the accident. So very much like Phineas Gage, there's this abrupt change in behavior. West's criminal career started 2 years after the head injury at the age of 19. Now, of course, we don't know for certain that it was that head injury that precipitated this, but the fact that we're seeing this over and over again, that we have people who are in prison and we find out that they've had head injuries as children, seems to suggest that there's something going on here. So that brings me to the final study I'm going to show you, which is a study done by my lovely former student, Pietro Manzella, in a prison in Turin, along with the prison psychologist known as Marco Bozzi, who was willing to work with us. And what Pietro did with Marco's help was that he worked in this prison in Turin, where they had individuals who were part of a drug rehabilitation program, because all of these people had, as part of their criminal record, a drug taking problem as well. So we compared the people, inmates, so these the red and the red hatched bars, with healthy controls. And what we see for a start is that anyone who's either one of the two reds is much worse than anyone who's blue. So basically, very similar to what I was saying before, that people who have taken drugs and have had drug problems, they perform poorly on my task, because all of these people, the ones in red, have got some sort of drug issue going on. And the people in the red full bar, they're the ones who are drug addicts, but also had some sort of traumatic brain injury, TBI, during their childhood. So they've got a double whammy compared to the people in the middle bars, the speckled red bar. So the speckled red bar, they're the ones who had a drug addiction problem, but the ones with the red bar have a drug addiction problem and a traumatic brain injury, and that seems to give them a double whammy and even worse performance. So what we're seeing here is, again, that these problems of head injuries and drug taking are creating possibly additive problems for these people. Now, this is a very small study in terms of numbers, so we do need to replicate it, but it is suggestive that there's something going on. Now, what I'd like to suggest is that, given what we know from the work that we've done with JEF, could we use it to help reduce reoffending? So if we have an adult who has some sort of traumatic brain injury, such as a Phineas Gage or something like that, then if they're fortunate enough to see a neurologist or neuropsychologist and then end up in a rehabilitation program, we can try to improve their lives. But if we have a child who is beaten around or is whatever, is having lots of head injuries that are not diagnosed as brain injuries, they can grow up into an adult with an undiagnosed brain injury. Now, because of the difficulties that, as I said, can have happened for people like Fred West, etc., what this can cause is a preponderance to some sort of criminal activity and therefore jail. Now, when these people have done their time, they're released from the prison, but the problem is that they're still an adult with an undiagnosed brain injury. And what we think is happening is that that undiagnosed brain injury is driving further reoffending. And in the UK, the statistics show that when someone is released from prison, there's up to a 50% chance that they'll be back in prison within a year, and that's known as recidivism. So the continual cycle of offending and reoffending after being released. And 50% is huge, and it costs something like £50,000 or £60,000 to keep someone in prison for a year. So that's a huge drain on society, and we know that this system is not working because they keep coming back. So we need to break the cycle of recidivism. So what I'd like to suggest is that instead of just wagging our fingers at these people in prison, we can diagnose them as someone with an undiagnosed brain injury and try to do work with them with tests like My One Jeff and give them a diagnosis, give them an assessment, and work out where they have certain problems, like I showed you with that particular the performance graph. Once we've worked out what sorts of problems that person has got, we can try to do rehabilitation with them so that they can avoid the types of problems that they got into, which led them to prison in the first place. And therefore, a positive outcome and hopefully breaking that cycle of recidivism. Now, unfortunately, apart from killing someone, I'm finding it really difficult to get into prisons. So if you're someone who works in the prison services or anything related to this and you think that this is interesting, then please do get in touch, because we're having difficulties just for logistic reasons to get into prison. So if you're interested, please do get in touch. So to summarize, the human brain seems to be more complex than that of almost any other animal, and the prefrontal cortex seems to be the kind of ground zero for everything. And damage can result in a myriad of different problems, and the functioning can also be affected by recreational drugs and different types of medication, and also just getting older. Now, we also know that damage during childhood could play a contributory role to criminal behavior and the continual cycle of reoffending. And so what we'd like to do is to say that we've developed this new test, Jeff, and we'd like clinicians and researchers to work with us to use this in different situations with the kids with brain injury, with kids with developmental disorders, or people who are working with drug addiction problems, or people who are working with offenders, in the hope that we can help these clinicians and healthcare professionals and teachers to help the kids that they're working with. Okay, finally, I just want to give a plug to the research that my team is doing on face recognition, memory and amnesia, dementia, stroke rehab. That's the work that Pedro is doing, and the work that I've been telling you about today on executive functions. And if you're interested in this work, we're trying to do as much work as possible in each of these different areas, and some of it can be done remotely online, and some of it needs in-person testing. If you're interested, then please do get in touch with us. Claudia Pulcini is a PhD student of mine, and she can take emails from anyone. So it's c.pulcini@gold.ac.uk. We'd love to hear from you. And you don't have to volunteer to do the studies right now. It can be any time in the future. So I've run over time a bit, but I'd like to thank you for your patience. The next talk, we're creating the details for it, but it's going to be about very bizarre brain disorders and what they tell us about the healthy brain. So, for example, there's a disorder called Capgras syndrome, where people think that their relatives have been replaced by imposters, and we want to know, we're trying to work out what does that tell us about the healthy brain. There's something called phantom limb syndrome, where after a limb has been amputated, someone still feels the pain. So what I'm going to try to do is to give you a kind of a journey around these disorders to show what that teaches about the healthy brain. That will probably be next Saturday at 5 o'clock, but I'll confirm that once it's been organized. So in a little while, I'm going to go outside and meet some of my lovely neighbors for hopefully some sort of gin and tonic or glass of wine. But that will be after I've taken some questions from you. So I'm just going to go and make myself a preparatory cup of tea first. Okay, I'm back. I'm just letting the tea brew properly, because tea has to be done properly, as you know. Well, I hope you know. And tea is very important for calming me down. Okay, so I've just looked at the questions, and there's some lovely questions. So here we go. Right. So the first question was from Natasha Ganya. And Natasha asks, is there a relationship between the interval of time patient with ABI has been in coma and their performance on the JEF-C task? That's a really interesting question. So what Natasha is asking there is that if a child has some sort of brain injury and they end up in coma, after they come out, what is their performance like on my task? And does it depend on how long they're in coma? Because it's known that the length of a coma can actually impact the amount of brain injury there is. It's a great question, Natasha, but we don't know. I've done one study with the French version of the task of JEF-C and with colleague Mathilde Chavignard in Paris, and we didn't have enough kids who'd been in coma. But we need to have a larger number before we can answer that question. But what I would predict is that, yes, a longer time in coma would impact performance on JEF-C, which would therefore imply that there's been more brain damage. So I think there would be something going on there. If you know people who work in the field and who'd be interested in looking at it, then I'd be very interested in sharing the task with them. So the next one is from, I think it's Ayu Amir from King's College, which is that do video games also activate the VTA, that sweet spot that's involved in addiction? That's a great question because we're now beginning to see that although addiction is usually thought of with reference to drugs and drinking, behavioral addictions also exist. So gambling is now recognized, at least by some organizations, as a proper addiction, as a medical addiction, and I think it's in the in a manual that is used by a lot of psychologists for diagnosis. And what we're trying to work out is whether gaming also does that. But there's enough work that's shown that the types of problems that are happening in the brain of people who are majorly into gaming are basically in the same areas as the areas that have become deficient in drug addicts as well. So, for example, a study has looked at South Korean kids who are really hooked on to the World of Warfare game, I think it's called. And they've looked at what's happening in their brains when they are looking at that game, or even just photographs from that game, and the same parts of the brain are becoming activated. So what that implies is that even something like gaming is creating an addiction. And we're seeing that there's problems in a lot of countries with addiction to mobile phones and online, playing online, etc., to the point that, if I'm correct in thinking, in Japan, there are actually addiction centers where they take your phone away from you and you have to survive for X number of days without your phone. And that's another behavioral addiction. And in fact, one of my MSc students, Andrea, she was actually doing a research study on gamers to try to see if we could pick up some of these issues. So we're very interested in applying our findings to gaming. So if you know of this area, do get in touch with us. Next question is from Denise Halterman. When you send in a question, do let the team know where you're writing from, because it's nice to know where you're writing from. So Denise Halterman asks, how does pregnancy brain work? What changes, and why do pregnant women have cognitive problems, and is it to do with hormones? The short answer is yes. And in fact, from the women I know who've had babies, they've told me that they've gone from being able to have a high-powered job to suddenly that mental fogginess that I talked about with chemo brain. Of course, it's not as bad as a chemo brain, but it is a hormonal thing. And in fact, there is research that's shown that if you look at women's cognitive abilities, so those thinking abilities, at different points in the estrous cycle, their cognitive abilities are different. So even without pregnancy, during the 4-week of the cycle, the menstrual cycle, thinking abilities are different. So what that implies is that because those are hormonally driven at the point in the estrous cycle, that there must be something happening. They're having a direct impact on cognition. So with a pregnant woman, where there's this ramping up of the hormones, then it's extremely likely that those are that's the cause of some of these issues. We have tried to do some small studies with Jeff, looking at women at different points in their estrous cycle and also at pregnant women, but it's quite a difficult study to get because you need to control for a number of different factors. But I'm pretty sure that we'd see major differences on Jeff. Okay, so the next question is from Anisha Desai, who's a speech and language therapist that we know. And Anisha has asked, does the chemo include patients who've had, do the chemo patients include neuro-oncology patients that had resections as well? Actually, the general chemo brain is not to do with resection, so people who've had a tumor removed like EVR that I talked about. But in fact, we've published a separate paper on patients who've only had a tumor resection. So it's basically lots of patients like EVR. And that was actually the study, the photograph that I showed at the beginning of me in Cape Town with the piece of art at the back with the pole through the head. The two people in that photograph with me, they're the ones at King's College who are involved with these patients with tumor resections. And what we found is that these patients who had tumors removed, they performed significantly worse on JEF than they did on other tasks. So Felicity Sykes has asked, can it also help at a later stage of life? Felicity, it would help if you said what you meant by it, but I'm going to assume that you mean meditation, because I'm imagining it's not to do with the tumor resections. I think you're talking about meditation, and I don't think it's too late to ever start meditation. I think, of course, as with anything, if you start earlier in life, whether it's keep fit or learning another language, it's easier. But I don't think it's ever too late. The next question again is also from Ayu Amir from, I think it's King's College, asking, does the amount of use of technology and social media worsen the effects of aging and or cognitive functions? I think that that's a very complicated question, because use of technology and social media, whether that's good or bad is too broad. Because when I was talking, for example, about the therapy clinics for kids who are addicted to their mobile phones, that's about an addiction. But that's suggesting that all social media use or technology use is bad. But social media and technology, etc., are tools, and as with all tools, etc., it's about appropriate usage. And I would probably think that use of technology and social media, if used appropriately, is actually really good. So my darling friend Gilly Longden, for example, who I hope is listening in, she's in her late 70s, and Gilly is able to use computers and find out how to get new accounts for different things, sort out her printer, etc., because she keeps going. I think a general thing that we have in cognition is use it or lose it. So that kind of decline that we get with aging, that's basically something that is happening. But then there are things that can reduce that downward slope. And mindfulness is an example. Good diet, being cognitively engaged and active mentally, will be very useful. So I don't think that we can have a broad statement about technology making things worse. I think that it depends on what the technology is, how it's being used, and to what level. Isabella Benson has asked what is oppositional defiance disorder, ODD. I'm afraid, Isabel, I don't actually know the details of it. However, if you send me an email to a.jansari@goal.ac.uk, I will get you some information, because one of my students, Kim Corbett, she's going to be working on kids, and she's a deputy head at a primary school, and that will also answer the next question from Helen Rodwell, who asked about a reference for the LAC kids. So the LAC is the looked after children, and this is a finding that children who've been in foster care, they tend to have a very specific set of cognitive problems, and some of them are to do with the front of the brain, and it's not a much researched area, so we want to use Jeff to try to unpick what things might be going on there. So Helen and Isabel, if you both get in touch with me by email, I'll see what Kim can help us with to get you some more information. Next question from Simon Unger. Hello, Simon. He's asked, do we know if addicts' executive function might be lower than average before they became addicted? Could it be that some people are prone to addiction, partly due to poor executive function? That's a fantastic question. So Simon's question is effectively the chicken and egg question. Is it nature or nurture? So I said that people who overuse certain substances develop these forms of addiction and therefore end up with poorer executive functions, etc. What Simon is asking is it the addiction that's caused the poor executive functions, or is it poor executive functions to begin with that caused the addiction? So this is the chicken and egg thing. Now, if you think about when I was talking about the work with ex-offenders, when I said that it could be that that maybe they were just people who had lots of fights, and because of lots of fights they ended up with these head injuries, and then also in prison. But what we can see is that when we look at their head injuries, they tend to have been when they were younger, before the criminal activity started. And so there we can suggest some sort of causal role whereby the head injury during childhood may have contributed to later criminality. But with the addiction, we don't actually know that that's the case, because we don't know whether the addiction was caused by poorer decision making that is already part of their physical makeup, so their nature, and that results in the behavior, which is the addiction, or whether the addiction causes the executive functions. So it's a really good question, and I know that there's research that I don't do myself, which has been looking at the genetics of addiction and looking at what are the biological factors that predispose some people to addiction over others. So I think it's going to take a long time to unpick those things, but I think that it's a really good, relevant question. So thanks. Next question is from Lorraine King. Can we get Jeff to use in clinical practice? Ish, yes. I'm very open to clinicians using Jeff, so just send me an email and we can sort that out. So send me an email again to a.jansari@goal.ac.uk. Then the next question is from Jane Antoinette Croucher. There seems to be some major disagreements whether helmets protect boxers, i.e. the Olympic Committee now only says men should wear them. What do you think, and do you wear a helmet when you cycle? The second question is easy because I don't cycle, but if I cycled, I would wear a helmet because I think that's just asking for trouble. And I'm a very clumsy person, so if someone's going to have an accident, it's me. So I should be padded before I go out anyway. The thing about helmets and boxing, I think boxing should be banned, let alone helmets on boxers. Boxing is a fucking brutal. It's not a sport. Excuse my swearing, but anything that involves people being paid to beat the living daylights out of each other is not a sport, given what we know about small head injuries. So I think I don't care what the Olympic Committee says about helmets in boxing. They just shouldn't have boxing. Sorry to sound so hard, but I really don't think it's appropriate. And if they're going to be stupid enough to box, then they should be wearing helmets. I just think it's ludicrous not to. So Sally Ann Winston asked a question. Did you have any conclusions about the causation and direction of addiction? Sally Ann, thanks for that question. So I just answered the question to Simon. So I think your question had come in already before I answered that. So we don't know the causation. So as I answered to Simon, we don't know what is the chicken and what is the egg. There might be some genetic or biological propensity to take up certain drugs or not to be able to say no, and that could result in the downstream problems. As we tend to find in anything to do with human behavior, it's never all or none. So it's probably part of the thing, but I doubt whether it's the only thing. And then, my lovely friend Andrew James from Sydney has asked, are there sex differences in the childhood JEF results? The answer is yes. We are picking up some gender differences on JEF, and at the moment the numbers are not big enough. But in fact, I need to look at the data from Tehran again to look at that. Certainly with the data that we've got from London, which are on smaller numbers, we are seeing some gender differences. And the reason that that's important is because to other people is that boys and girls' brains do develop differently, and girls' brains do mature quicker than girls' brains. Sorry, girls' brains develop quicker than boys' brains, and so their executive functions we predict will be slightly ahead, and we are seeing some differences. We don't have any conclusive proof yet, but from Jeff, but the results do tend to point in that direction. So Jonathan Gossage, who I think is in Canada, has asked, has there been any research on the deterioration of physical functions due to aging and any possible association with mental function deterioration? That's a tricky one because the physical with the mental, it's difficult to draw any conclusions about the two together. I think being physically active does have health benefits. We know that there are health benefits of being physically active. So exercise does actually have an impact on cognition, so your thinking abilities, alertness, etc. So I think physical deterioration is probably going to have some sort of impact on mental deterioration as well. But I don't think it's a one-to-one thing, because there are people who've never been very physically active who are still nonetheless extremely alert and effective. So I don't think that the two go arm in arm, but being physically active certainly can help your mental functions. Okay, so Lorraine has written in again, and she'd like to use Jeff. So yes, do get in touch, Lorraine, and I'll let you have it. David Villagomez has asked, "Is there a Spanish version of JEF-C?" Not yet, but David, shall we work on one? Because we are actively translating Jeff into as many languages as we can. And what I need is collaborators in the different cultures to work with me. Currently, we've got Jeff in about 10 languages, French, Dutch, Danish, Swedish, Finnish, Italian, Russian, Hebrew, Persian, Japanese, and a couple of others, but we don't have Spanish yet. And I have actually been trying to get a Spanish collaborator. So David, please do get in touch, because I'd be very interested in working with someone for a Spanish version of the task. So Denise Holterman has asked a question, which is, has said, it's not a question, but you might want to comment. I work in a jail with those offenders that have addictions. I see the effects of early brain trauma and have made it part of my assessment. I see that in their offending behaviors and how they do not possess the reasoning skills, they rationalize things in a very odd way that leads to problems. So Denise is effectively saying that what I showed about that data that Pietro had collected in the prison in Turin with people with who have drug addictions and who are in prison as well, that she's seeing in her work with people when she's assessing them in the prison, that their reasoning skills are very different. And those reasoning skills are effectively what we're picking up on. But the thing is that the thing about Jeff, for those who are clinically or research minded, is that it demonstrates greater ecological validity than current tests. And ecological validity, for those who don't know that term, which will be most of you, is the correspondence between what happens in the clinic on the test and what happens in the outside world. Hence my example of my glasses, that without the glass, I'm blind as a bat, I can't even see the little video thing on my laptop here. And the assessment that the clinician, in this case the optician, has given me allows me to have these glasses to help me to see the computer screen. And that same ecological validity doesn't yet exist for tests of executive function, and my task Jeff is more ecologically valid than current tests, and we've published a number of papers on that. So that's what you're picking up on, that their inability to rationalize. You're seeing it in an everyday basis, just like me being blind, but it's not yet being picked up on standard tests, and that's what we're trying to do with my task. Next question, Caroline Bloom. Caroline, I think Caroline's a GP. I think she's in my choir. She's asked, once you're 60, is it too late to start meditation to help the brain, or is it never too late? I think that's the same as what Felicity asked earlier. I don't think it's ever too late. None of us can roll the clock backwards and start things that we wished we could have done, but we can certainly not waste the time that we've got left. And I don't think it's ever too late to start anything. So start meditating. And if you're interested, if anyone is interested, I would recommend the standard 8-week course. Mindfulness meditation is a huge, or meditation is a huge area. Mindfulness meditation is a huge area within it, and there's lots of different packages. And I think it's really important to be careful on which package you go for. If anyone is interested, then they should email me. They can email me if they want, because it's the 8-week course that I recommend, that was developed by John Kabat-Zinn and others. Kate Betts has asked, if ADT can impair certain cognitive functions, would MPA used with sex offenders have a similar effect? I'm afraid, Kate, I don't know what MPA is, so I wouldn't be able to answer that question. Sorry. So, Rosie Ball has asked, I noticed that the performance on your task by the control groups varied hugely. Please, could you explain? Yes, because each of the tasks is for different groups. So, for each of our studies, we match our control group to the particular experimental group. So our control group for our prostate cancer study was men in their late 50s and early 60s. And we know that performance on JEF or executive functions gets lower as you get older anyway. So even the control participants in that task will be worse than controls in some of the other studies where people were younger. So it's always about the matching of the appropriate groups, but we have got a very large database where we've pooled all of the control data so that we can give what are called norms for the study. So it is possible to get those norms so that we can see what average performance is as a function of age, gender, and IQ. Okay, next question is from Aoife Stone Gariani, I think, which is, why does damage to the frontal lobe sometimes result in reduced irritation and sometimes not? Do we think, reduced initiation and sometimes not? Do we think initiation is linked to a specific area in the frontal cortex? Speech and language therapist who's working in neurology. That's an interesting question, yes. So what Aoife is asking is about damage to the frontal lobes and why people tend to have the reduced initiation. So they'll sit there in sometimes what we call catatonia, where they don't really start things. And this actually goes back to a very old model of executive functions by Norman and Challis called the supervisory attentional system, that to initiate behavior, you need certain control centers to energize you and to move you forward. And another model by Stuss and Benson has also said that one of the functions of the frontal lobe is to start behavior, because what we're doing at any moment is doing our next behavior. And sometimes we have to change that behavior. So if I want to do something right now, I've got to energize and initiate a new sequence, which is getting up and going to the door, or etc. If I can't initiate that, then I'll just sit here and do nothing. And what's been found is that patients with frontal lobe disorder do end up, some of them, with initiation disorders. Now, an important thing here is that the brain, the frontal lobes, is a third of the whole brain. So that's a lot of different stuff going on. So when we talk about frontal lobe damage, we are covering a massive, massive area. So the next line of research is looking at damage to this part compared to this part, to that part, to that part. And so the initiation problems will be damage to certain areas. It won't be to for wholesale frontal damage. It will be to very specific areas. But there is work that's being done that's looking at that. So yes, we do think that that initiation is an issue with frontal functioning. Shileka Roy Basu, who I think is in Kolkata, has asked, you said that there's cognitive decline in cancer patients due to treatment. Do you think it can be managed through mindfulness meditation? I think that mindfulness is something that we think is going to help certain aspects of executive functions and cognitive functions in general. The interesting thing next would be to see where those improvements are. So the problem for trying to evaluate that is that you need longitudinal studies, because mindfulness is a program that you do for 8 weeks, and then it takes quite a while as you get into the it takes quite a while for those differences to reveal themselves. But given some of the work that has been done before with mindfulness and seeing the impacts on the brain, I think that that is something that can be demonstrated, and I'm sure there are studies that have looked at mindfulness and how it can help oncology patients. I don't know the details of it, but I would hazard a guess that they would. Of course, kind of similar to the initiation answer, we don't know which aspects of executive functions will be improved. It won't be wholesale everything, but it will improve certain aspects. And this will, of course, be about where does mindfulness have its impact? Does it have its impact here? If oncology messes up this area, then the mindfulness, if it's helping here, is not going to help. So it kind of depends on this thing that we're obviously trying to work out, which is going to take us a long time, which is working out where are the changes happening, where are the negative things going on, and where are the positive things going on. So that, of course, is the next exciting line of research that's going to happen now. So Lola Sucker Chibat, so one of Andrea's relatives, I think, asked, would birth by forceps injure the frontal lobe? That's an interesting question. I'm sure there must be research on it. I don't know the answer. I imagine that this is done in a way that they have to be very careful, so that they're cupping the whole of the head rather than the front. But I don't know the details of forceps deliveries. But I imagine that they have to be very careful because the bones of the skull are very soft when we're born, and they grow and they move apart, etc., to allow that developing brain to grow within it. So they have to be very, very, very careful. So I imagine that that's taken into consideration, but that's more an educated guess than from knowing anything in particular. Oh, that was Andrea's mum. Well, hello, mum. Remember me from graduation? So that is all of the questions I've got at the moment. I can't see any more questions, so I'm going to call it a day unless I hear any more questions come in. So I'd like to thank you very much again for coming to the talk today and for your patience. And I've gone on a bit, but I hope that's a good sign. Please do get in touch with us about anything to do with the talk. If you're interested in using JEF, then do email me, a.jansari@gold.ac.uk. There are those questions for the teachers on ODD and LAC kids, or anything that you'd like to know that's relevant to my talk. Thank you again. Next talk will be this time next week. And if you are going to a Eurovision party, then enjoy it. If you're not, enjoy your evening anyway. Thank you very much. Goodbye.